Imagine that tomorrow, Google announce that they have invented a machine learning system that can tell fact from fiction, that can determine truth from lie. And this is a magical psychology land experiment. So in this experiment, in this thought experiment, the machine learning system is right all the time. And then they say that they've hooked it up to the Google search results and YouTube recommendations. So now when you search for vaccinations, well, only the scientific consensus comes up. All the anti-vax stuff is down on page 6 and page 7, where no one's going to look. YouTube videos on conspiracy theories start to just be recommended less and less and less, and the ones debunking them keep coming up at the top. It still matters whether the search result is engaging and relevant and well-referenced, but now it also matters objectively whether it's true. And then you realize that this new system, this algorithm, it disagrees with you on something really important, and it produces a result that you find abhorrent. Now, I struggle to find an emotive example for this that wouldn't also be too sensitive for an audience like this. So, as this is the Royal Institution in London, and it is September 2019, imagine that this machine learning system concludes that it would be a good idea to have a no-deal Brexit. Okay, no, that was, don't applaud that. That was a cheap shot. So that was a cheap shot, and there may be people in here who genuinely believe that. So for those people, please imagine the extreme opposite conclusion, that this system believes it would be a good idea to dissolve the United Kingdom into Europe entirely. Like, this is a system that in this thought experiment does create objective truth, and it disagrees with one of your fundamental core values. What's more likely? A, that you are going to just go, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to be heard less and less, and I guess we'll just have to deal with that. Or B, that you decide that instead you need to shout louder and that the algorithm is wrong. So, for the next hour, I want to talk about the state of play for science communication and broadcast communication in general for an audience that has wildly different ideas and areas of knowledge on how that works right now. I want to talk about why some science communication seems to go everywhere and a lot of it doesn't. And to give advice for people who are trying to reach out and to broadcast their truth, and whether that's for small individual groups putting out content, or whether it's big corporations and charities who are trying to do outreach. That's also going to include a dive into the concept of parasocial relationships, those odd one-way relationships that appear in other media a lot. Because if you want to understand how to reach an audience, then you need to understand what that audience is looking for. And I want to talk about one particular set of things that are increasingly governing the media we consume and everything in our lives: algorithms. The ones that recommend the videos you watch on YouTube, the search results on Google, the order that your Twitter feed appears in, and basically everything that includes recommendations on social media these days. And from the corporation's point of view, which advertising to show you. Now, there are a couple of caveats here. I have generalized this talk as much as I possibly can. I've run it past quite a few folks in my industry, but I am speaking from a position of success. I'm lucky enough to have 1.9 million subscribers on YouTube at the minute. There we go. Didn't quite get to 2 million in time. Now, subscribers is not a particularly useful metric. That's more a function of how long you've been on the platform and how many one-hit wonders you've had. It's more honest to say that an average science communication video from me gets somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million views. And those might be about linguistics, which is what my degree is actually in. They might be about the basics of computer science, where I'm self-taught but checking my script with experts. Or they might be about infrastructure and science and interesting things in the world, which is where I go out on location and I hand over to people who know what they're talking about. Now, my degree is in linguistics with a research master's in educational studies, but ultimately, I'm in this position because I spent 15 years throwing things at the internet before something worked. I was extremely lucky that the thing that turned out to work was science communication, was going out and telling the world about things I'm interested in. I am even luckier that it turned out to involve filming on location. In the past few years, I've been lucky enough to experience zero gravity. I have gone to the Arctic. I have flown with the Red Arrows. And yes, that is mostly a brag and mostly just an excuse to show the best photo of me that will ever be taken in my life. Like, have you ever looked at a photo of yourselves and thought, it's all downhill from here? Because it is. One more caveat. For those of you who've been to a Royal Institution discourse before, you'll know there are generally two types. There is one where a researcher with a PhD and an associate professorship talks about their research, and there is one where someone in arts and culture shares their experience. This is more of the latter. Some of what I say is going to be opinion and not fact, and hopefully this audience will be able to tell the difference. There are points in here where I explicitly say I do not have all the answers. And I also want to add one conflict of interest note as well. My company gets a lot of its revenue from the adverts that go on and around YouTube videos, which means that my rent is indirectly paid by Google Ireland. Can't imagine why it's in Ireland. Just no reason at all why they'd set up there instead of the UK. Not a word of this discourse has been passed by anyone in Google. They don't even know I'm doing it. I'm not employed by them, but ultimately, while I'm willing to irritate that company and bite the hand that feeds me, they are indirectly paying my rent. I can try to represent the folks who have not been as lucky, who the algorithm has turned against, but I'm quite happy with them right now, and a lot of other people aren't. So anyway, that's the plan. This is the state of science communication in the English-speaking world at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. And to understand how it works, we need to start with the algorithm. Algorithm, in this context, means quite a bit different from what people with a lot of experience in mathematics and computer science might think it does. The algorithm is referred to in the singular, which is the almost anthropomorphized name that's given to this collection of machine learning systems. I went to a conference for science communicators last year, and after about 3 or 4 hours, we realized that we had to ban the word from conversation, because while a lot of folks from YouTube would just sort of endlessly froth about it, anyone not on the platform just found it confusing and messy, and we would not shut up. So when I talk about the algorithm, I'm talking about this sort of almost magical black box of code. And the idea is that you set up this black box, and then you provide it with a list of human-curated examples, and it works out their distinguishing features, provides some sort of categorization system, and then as you throw novel examples at it, it categorizes them and learns from feedback. And those distinguishing features may be completely novel or completely unknown to humans. So one of Google's recent AI projects was looking at retinal photography. And this recent paper claims that with uncanny accuracy, it was able to look at retinal photos and work out gender, with sex, with 97% accuracy, age within 4 years, and better than chance at smoking status, blood pressure, major adverse cardiac events. Eye doctors now cannot detect any of those things themselves. They're not really sure how the machine did it. Now, it's right to be skeptical of some of those claims. Maybe there's a difference in the metadata. Maybe the retinal photography machine, I guess that's technically a camera, is set up or focused differently depending on some of those attributes. But the paper does a pretty good job of covering their bases there. And maybe a human could also be trained to pick out those differences. It's just that nobody's bothered when you can just look at the chart next to the patient. But the simplest black box machine learning system is essentially categorizing pictures. You give it a load of pictures of cats, and you give it a load of pictures of things that are not cats, and then you ask it, is this new picture a cat? Which sounds like it's going to be useless unless you're trying to design a filter for adult content, and you're sending it pornography and not pornography, and the aim is to have a classifier that can look at a photo it's never seen before and work out whether you should show that to all ages or not. Of course, it's not that simple. There are stories after stories after stories of machine learning systems that have failed through bad training data, or more likely, biased training data. And this is slightly outside my ballpark. I know Hannah Fry covered this in her lecture here a while ago, but I have a very I have an example that's very close to my heart. YouTube uses a machine learning system to try and detect whether videos are suitable for advertisers to place their adverts next to. It was rolled out a little bit too fast, and before it was entirely ready, because YouTube had one of the many little scandals that they have, and they needed to do something to reassure their advertisers. So, this is a highly abridged summary based on unofficial conversations and innuendo and scuttlebutt. I'm breaking no NDAs here, but the story goes that they provided the machine learning system with a big block of videos that were definitely 100% safe for advertisers. And then they gave it a big block that were definitely not. And they told the system to be fairly conservative because it was only a first line of defense. If it deemed your video unsuitable, you could send it off to humans for review. And this is, in my industry, a fairly controversial thing to say, but I don't think that's an unreasonable solution to a very difficult problem. YouTube has 500 hours of content, 500 hours of video. I'm not saying content. YouTube has 500 hours of video uploaded every minute. That's a human lifetime every single day. It is not unreasonable to have a machine learning system be the first line of defense as long as there's a human review behind it. And nowadays it's working fairly well with some high-profile exceptions. But the problem, so I'm told, was that there was a bias in the training data. Channels, people, talking about LGBT issues were more likely to talk explicitly about sex in some of their videos. Not all of them, not the majority of them, but enough that the machine learning system figured out there was a correlation between people talking about LGBT stuff and people talking about explicit sex. Again, only in a small number of videos, but enough that when the machine learning system found something to be about being gay, it viewed it as more likely to be unsafe. Now, the YouTube CEO said in a recent interview, we work incredibly hard to make sure that when our machines learn something, because a lot of our decisions are made algorithmically, that our machines are fair. I know some YouTube employees, I'm friends with some YouTube employees, I believe that they work incredibly hard to minimize that bias, but it's still there. And algorithmic bias is a major concern for every single machine learning system. The systematic biases in the wider world have already found their way to social media without machine learning being involved. Of the top 10 earning creators on YouTube right now, as of 2018, as of last year, of the top 10, all of them are male, and I'm well aware that I'm in the Royal Institution giving this talk. One of the reasons that I got that audience in the first place, one of the reasons I ended up standing here, is because I'm a white guy with a British accent that sounds authoritative. Trying to make sure that artificial intelligence doesn't inherit these systemic biases is an incredibly difficult job. And it's one for Hannah Fry and her crew, and not for someone who got a linguistics degree. When YouTube handed over that recommendation engine to machine learning, they set it to increase watch time. This is what they told everyone. If people stuck around watching your video all the way to the end, and it was 20 minutes long, then it was viewed as good by the system. At which point they fell foul of Goodhart's law. When a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So people made longer videos, and they put all the important stuff at the very end, forcing people to watch all the way through. So worse videos were being recommended. So now, YouTube's official line is that they reward high-quality videos that keep people on platform. Now, that may not be videos on the same channel by the same creator in the same genre. In 2017, Jim McFadden, who was then technical lead for YouTube recommendations, he talked about the new engine they had that came from a department wonderfully called Google Brain. One of the key things it does, he says, is it's able to generalize. Whereas before, if I watched this video from a comedian, our recommendations were pretty good at saying, here's another one just like it. But the Google Brain model figures out the other comedians who are similar, but not exactly the same, even more adjacent relationships. It's able to see patterns that are less obvious. And as for which videos to recommend, well, one of the new model's basic ideas is that if someone comes to YouTube because of your video, tick, that's a good thing. And if someone does not leave YouTube because of your video, does not stop watching, that's a good thing. So the black box takes in those signals and it works out what's going to keep people on our platform, what's going to keep them watching the videos and, again, more importantly for Google, watching the adverts in between. Incidentally, apparently Google also serves more adverts to people who are more tolerant to adverts. If you'd like two adverts to appear less often before your video, skip them more. That was bad advice to give for someone who makes his money from that. Because you've got to remember, like all these big companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they are essentially advertising companies. Almost all their revenue comes from being the greatest marketing, advertising, targeting company that the world has ever seen. Their ideal is that every advert is perfectly targeted to you. And as all of you will be aware, they haven't got there yet. But it turns out if you reward videos that keep people on platform, then what you end up with is conspiracy theories and clickbait. And yes, all of the companies that have algorithms are working on fighting disinformation because they are aware that it's a public relations disaster for them. But they are doing it in English first. We'll get back to that later. From a creator perspective, the algorithm is often seen as being a bit like a Skinner box. It's an operant conditioning chamber. It is a food dispenser that might give you some money if you tap the lever enough. Google and YouTube and Twitter will never tell you what their algorithm is looking for, because every bit of information they give away means that there's more opportunity for people to abuse it and send spam. But from my perspective, the pellets come out at random and we all develop sort of superstitions and we all keep pushing the lever. I was lucky enough this year to have a conversation with the head of product for recommendations at Google, the person in charge of the algorithm. And it seems like the idealized version of what they want for that sort of recommendations that appear next to your video is that it's a bit like, and this is something that shows my age, it's a bit like a TV guide. It's a bit like the Radio Times. Every single channel should always have something on it that is interesting to you, all the time. It should be a transparent glass layer between the audience and what they want to see. And the question is, as they're weighing up all those videos, how much they put their finger on the scale, how much they make that TV guide be for the worthy, honesty, truth-seeking version of you and not the clickbait conspiracy version of you. Because ultimately, yes, sometimes you want to watch a documentary, but sometimes you want to watch someone trip over and hurt themselves, like You've Been Framed existed for a reason. And I'm not just talking about YouTube. I'm talking about Twitter. I'm talking about every single algorithmic system out there. If all they're recommending is quick, short dopamine hits that just get you in, get you out, then that's not a long-term survival strategy. That spirals down into the lowest common denominator, which ultimately hurts the world. But if they don't have some of that in there, then people are going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to the company that does have that. If everything is painstakingly verified and educational, then only a minority of folks are going to watch it. Finding that balance, finding that solution. I said there were going to be analogies to older media. That's what TV commissioners still do. It's what the people programming the YouTube algorithm are trying to do. And let's be clear, it's an unsolvable problem. There is not some magical equilibrium in the middle that will make this work. It's about finding a balance. It is about finding the least worst option. You cannot have a successful platform that is all clickbait, but you also can't have a successful platform with no clickbait. Because either way, advertisers are going to leave, viewers are going to tire of it, and it's not sustainable long term. There have been plenty of investigations into the effects of the algorithm. Plenty of research, formal and informal, that showed how you could very, very easily go from something apolitical and then click again and find something just slightly political. And then click again and find something that's a little bit clickbait, but still honest. And then maybe something that's about moderately conservative politics that's a little bit untrue. And then on the next click, find something about why Hillary Clinton is evil and Donald Trump is the greatest thing to ever happen to the universe, or vice versa. The most notable recent investigation into online radicalization is this deep dive by the New York Times. And like I say, the companies are working in English first because the New York Times looked into radicalization in Brazil. And it includes one of the most sobering paragraphs I've seen in a while. Right-wing YouTubers had hijacked already viral Zika conspiracies and added a twist. Women's rights groups, they claimed, had helped engineer the virus as an excuse to impose mandatory abortions. Quoting Zeynep Tufekci, who was referring to research in the Wall Street Journal, videos about vegetarianism led to videos about veganism. Videos about jogging led to videos about running ultramarathons. It seems as if you are never hardcore enough for YouTube's algorithm. It promotes, recommends, and disseminates videos in a manner that appears to constantly up the stakes. Given its billion or so users, YouTube may be one of the most powerful radicalizing instruments of the 21st century. I worry quite a lot about how complicit I am in that. Ben McCohen-Wilson, his YouTube's UK managing director, had an interview. And obviously he disagrees with that. He says that the platform reduces the spread of content designed to mislead people and raises up authoritative voices. Note that he didn't say that those voices were true or that those voices were correct. He said they were authoritative. There's an old Jonathan Swift quote, and it took quite a lot of research to prove that this actually was a Jonathan Swift quote. Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. Quick show of hands, who saw this tweet? Few people? Yeah, there's about 10 or 12 in the audience. I mean, it did great numbers. The idea that Marmite, you lay the bottle on the side to get it out, that did great numbers. Who here saw the confession and the retraction? All right, about half as many people. Good. Sure, that's pretty much harmless. By the way, that is now the Marmite guy. That's what he's known as. Everyone assumed that had been fact-checked by someone, because it's not that important, right? But everyone always assumes that, particularly if it agrees with our preconceptions. I mean, the long-term solution is to teach information literacy in schools, but as a real-world education policy, that's about as useful as saying we should reduce our carbon emissions. It's true. How do we get there? I don't have the answer to that. Douglas Adams, in his novel Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, came up with the idea of a fictional bit of software called Reason, which is a program which allowed you to specify in advance which decision you wanted it to reach and only then give it all the facts. And the program's job, which it was able to accomplish with consummate ease, was simply to construct a plausible series of logical-sounding steps to connect the premises with the conclusion. In the novel, it was sold to the Pentagon, highly classified, and it explained why they spent so much on Star Wars missile defense. If you would like to be convinced of a thing, YouTube and Twitter and all the other networks will happily find you people to convince you. If you've lost your faith in God, then there will be happily dozens of evangelical preachers from all sorts of denominations who will happily bring you back into the fold, and dozens of angry atheists who will make sure you stay out of it. Take your pick, which way you want to fall. If you want to know who's to blame for what's wrong with the world right now, then I can find you hundreds of people who will get you apoplectically angry at billionaires or immigrants or both. Whichever way you want to go, there will be someone authoritative to tell you about it. So, how do we define that authority? There used to be gatekeepers. Or at least it seemed like there used to be gatekeepers. Science communication was in magazines and television and radio, and it meant that there wasn't any significant peer review system out there, but you knew that there were researchers at the back and standards and quality to keep these things fairly accurate. There were professionals. There was David Attenborough, there was James Burke, and a lot of other men, and they were all men who were all giving authority with the BBC to back them up. Which is certainly true, but for every planet Earth or connections, somewhere on a channel there would be an ancient mysteries or an in search of or ancient aliens. The Bible code became a phenomenon in the 1990s. This was the idea that there were certain hidden messages in the scriptures that could be tracked if you just went through exactly the right number of letters in a row. The Daily Mail loved that. They put it right on their front page, a splash above the headline, not because it was true, but because they knew it'd sell newspapers. We had gatekeepers. We definitely did have gatekeepers, but I'm not convinced that from the public's perspective, it was all that different to what we have today. Authority online often comes from having an audience. Why am I standing here giving this talk today? It's not because I've done 15 years of painstaking research into this stuff and that I'm now presenting my doctoral thesis to you. It's not because I have a particularly broad range of knowledge or depth of knowledge. It's because I've worked with the Royal Institution before that, you know I can present. I wouldn't pretend to know your motivations, Sean, but I think it's safe to say that I'm partly here because you knew you could sell tickets and you knew you'd get some clicks online from it, from having me associated with this. I'm not saying that's all of it. I'm saying that was probably a consideration. There is a reason that every major British documentary about space for the last 15 years has been presented by Professor Brian Cox. Except it's not just documentaries about space. That's Wonders of Life. That was about natural history. Sorry, I'm just going to take a moment. Oh, good, there he is. That joke would have landed a lot better if that had come up at the right time. Can we just take a minute to appreciate how bad the Photoshop job is, by the way? The lighting doesn't match. He's got a halo around his head, and that right arm isn't even cut out properly. It's an official BBC press photo. Anyway, this was billed as a physics-based approach to natural history. And yes, it did cover some pretty advanced physics concepts, but let's be honest, from a television commissioner's perspective, it's a bit of a reach. It was almost certainly an excuse to provide Brian Cox on television to the audience who want him to get those ratings in. I'm sure it was well researched. I'm sure they did a really good job of it, but Wonders of Life, with the extremely qualified dual biologist and astrophysicist no one's heard of, would not have had as many people watching it, and it would have been much harder to commission. How much is it worth to get someone less qualified but known to the audience rather than the best person for the job? Sister Wendy was not some great art historian. Her degree was in English. But in the 1990s, she presented 5 BBC series on art history because audiences liked her and would listen to her. In her obituary, the New York Times said her insightful, unscripted commentaries connected emotionally with millions. Danny Beck, a Norwegian neuroscientist, recently said this: "Your desire for a platform or interest in several sciences should not supersede your responsibility and ethical duty to not speak on topics you are not qualified to. There exist others who know better and can do the job. Consider amplifying their voice instead." And I agree with that, which is why the rest of this lecture will be No, it won't. It won't. But just for a moment, you believed me, and how did you feel about paying to come here and see that? Like the early videos in my educational series were the stereotypical guy who hasn't done his research and thinks he knows everything, spouting unsourced facts. There are still a heck of a lot of people who stand in front of a green screen or use voiceover and stock footage and provide no citations and no references and just ask people to trust them. I learned quickly not to do that, but the trouble is, sort of what the audience want. A loyal audience, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, does not want to see someone else's voice amplified. If I hit the retweet button on Twitter, I just take someone else's message wholesale with their face, I send it out to my audience, few people will pass it onwards. If I quote tweet it, if I take their message and then I add a bit of useless commentary around it with my face, that goes much further. Way more people interact, way more people pass it on. YouTube gives creators retention statistics. We get to see, on average, where people stay and leave a video. I will note that that chart does go up to 120%. Couple of reasons for that. One is that sometimes people go back and watch a bit again. That counts twice, that can go above. But also, it's because YouTube's graphing API just isn't good at percentages. There's a big drop-off in the first few seconds up there. It's not as people go, oh, I don't like that, or I don't like him, or this isn't what I thought. There's a big drop-off in the end, what's now called the end card and was once called the credits. But apart from that, just a steady slope downwards as people get bored. And the algorithm will look kindly on you if that slope is less steep. But if I go somewhere on location and I hand over to experts and experts carry most of the video, that graph will be steeper and retention will be lower. People will get bored more quickly and they'll share the video less. So how much do you pander to your audience? How much do you tell them what they want to hear, particularly when on YouTube there is literally a dollar amount attached to each video and attached to each view? How much do you make what your audience wants at a social cost? It's not just the viewers being sent down a rabbit hole of radicalization. It's also the creators. When you look at clickbait that brings in numbers and money, it can be very, very tempting to just cut your losses, double down on the clickbait and accept that, well, make money while it's coming in. Make hay while the sun shines, because in a couple of weeks, it could all go away. But the light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. In 1988, Jimmy Corti and Bill Drummond, the KLF, wrote How to Have a Number One the Easy Way, the manual. They'd had a novelty pop song hit the top of the charts a few months earlier, and the manual was a tongue-in-cheek guide to success in the music industry, how to achieve a number one with no money and no musical talent, which they said themselves that they'd managed. Almost all of it is out of date now. There's a wonderful section a couple of chapters in which says that by the mid-90s, someone in Japan will have invented a machine that lets you do this all from home without a recording studio. That was right. But at the very start, the little bit that is as true now as it was when it was written. The majority of number ones are achieved early in the artist's public career, before they've been able to establish reputations and build a solid fan base. Most artists are never able to recover from having one, and it becomes the millstone around their necks to which all subsequent releases are compared. Either the artists will be destroyed in their attempt to prove to the world there are other facets to their creativity, or they succumb willingly and spend the rest of their lives as a traveling freak show, peddling a nostalgia for those now far-off, carefree days. The Cheeky Girls. They wrote that 10 years before the Cheeky Girls. They wrote that 10 years, 20 years before YouTube came along, and it's exactly true for people online. And number one does not create a career, it can kill a career. If you've just got one hit, all the world will want to see is that one thing. A single video does not make you a YouTube star. A single tweet does not get you a book deal. Although, to be honest, that hasn't happened in 5 years anyway. A number one just makes you the person who repeats that catchphrase until everyone is tired of it. What you want to do is build up a catalogue of minor hits over time, get a little bit of respect, hone your trade, learn your craft, and then, once you've got a bit of an audience, then you can start aiming upwards. Bands and singers in the music industry is actually a really good analogy for how the internet works right now. After all, you know, Brian Cox does arena tours and arena shows and tours around the world. For the folks out there who are hoping to communicate science to the world, it is like starting a band or launching a music career or going out solo and singing. It will not pay the rent for the first few years or decades or maybe even ever. And if you are one of the lucky ones, if you make it, it will not set you up for life. And if you're an organization trying to get your message out, well, I used to think that people had a built-in corporate baloney detector. I used to think that anything that was put out by an institution or by an advertising agency was doomed to fail just because it wasn't authentic. And that's not true. That's not true at all. You know, remember what I said earlier, 500 hours of video per minute, not watched, uploaded. You know, 82 years of video content a day, and most of it took almost no time and effort to produce. But every one of those videos has more or less the same chance as that project that your organization spent 6 months and $1 million on. The most popular recurring series that I do right now is very simple. That's sped up, obviously. It is a 10-minute, one-take monologue to the camera about computer science. The camera does not move. The camera does not cut away. There are none of those jump cuts that a lot of people use. I can now completely understand why they do them. It's a lot easier. There are occasional graphics sometimes, but mostly it's just me and the camera. And that breaks all the rules established by television when I grew up. It breaks all the rules that corporate media types think that they need to make this work. It's not about spectacle. It's about people. To explain that, we need to talk about parasocial relationships. The term parasocial relationship was invented by these two, Donald Horton and Richard Vole, should really have fact-checked that. The term means that there is a difference between the spectator, the viewer, as we now call them, and the performer, what we now call the creator. That the spectator is emotionally invested in the person on screen, but the person on screen has no idea that the spectator exists. And if they do, there's such a power imbalance there that it couldn't possibly be a friendship. Parasocial relationships are not a new thing, and neither is turning them into money. Any celebrity that ever had an official fan club with a membership fee was doing exactly that. Actually, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a fad for celebrities to set up phone numbers that were their personal number or their personal voicemail. And some of them made a lot of money from it. That's Corey Feldman and Corey Hart. And if you think I didn't track down that advert to play it halfway through to get everyone's attention back, you're completely wrong.
You can listen to their private phone messages and get their personal number where you can leave them a message of your own. $2 the first minute, 45 cents each additional minute. Ask your parents before you call.
Yeah. I haven't tested the number. I don't imagine it works anymore. But those celebrities didn't have Twitter. Twitter is effectively someone's personal number. If you know that a celebrity is always on their phone, always typing on their computer, sending their thoughts out to the world, well, why not reply? Send them a message. They might notice it. They might actually reply to you personally. You might get attention from them. And suddenly it's not a weird parasocial relationship. They're your friend. More than that, because it's on social media, you can try to get that attention. You can try to get that over-the-top fandom. But it's also performative. It can also be competitive. All the fans can now see each other doing this. I have a couple of friends who have that sort of terrifying Beatlemania-esque fandom, that sort of kids screaming at Take That concerts, except they're not just folks around magazines now in small groups. They're not kids who come for a concert and scream at their idols and then disperse. They have notifications on for when their idol tweets so they can get the first reply in. They have group chats whose only distinguishing characteristic for the people in there is that they're all fans of this person. If you've ever wondered why kids would rather sit and watch a stream of someone playing a video game rather than just play the game themselves, it's not about the game. It's about the person playing it. A stream of a video game on its own isn't interesting, but someone you know or someone you think you know playing a video game, just hanging out with a friend, with a chat next to it. And if in that chat, that's a lot of friends hanging out. You're all just hanging out together, except that one of you has a lot more power and influence than the others, and often is indirectly asking for money. You'll notice that I'm not using any slides during this bit. I don't want to call out any particular individuals for what is basically just hustling. Patreon and Twitch subscriptions and YouTube memberships, all these tools they have to raise money for individual people are not inherently a bad thing. Patreon has meant that science communicators are able to support themselves despite the fact that sometimes their content is not advertiser friendly. So people who are talking about sex education or mental health or ancient weapons can all get money for their content and perhaps even not have to hold down a separate job, because individuals out in the world have thought, this should exist, and I'm willing to donate money to make that happen. Animators, writers, podcasters, the sorts of people who work incredibly hard and are only able to make what they do because people have chosen to support them. That is a brilliant thing. But when it starts to get unsettling, when it starts to get a little bit weird, is when it becomes not about supporting someone's craft, but about selling friendship. And if you think it's weird when I put it that way, yeah, you should. It's really weird. If you watch one of the really popular video game streamers on Twitch, which is a platform that is just video game streaming, you'll see they're almost always talking. They're watching the chat. They're reacting to the messages that are coming in. They're reading them out loud. They're replying to them. They're calling out the names that they've seen. They're greeting people who have been hanging around in that group for a long, long time. They are being friendly and open and on for hours at a time, performing exhausting emotional labor. They will thank anyone who sends them a tip, or even better yet, subscribes, because in a world where Netflix costs $13 a month, subscriptions to a single person on Twitch can be $5 or $10 or $25 a month. And depending on what you pay, that might affect what perks you get back and what attention you get. And if someone does repeat their subscription, join again, then they can choose to announce it to the whole stream. A little animation that says how long they've been subscribed for. You'll see people on Twitch say, hey, so-and-so, thanks for being part of the cult for 4 years. That's literally language I heard while researching this. That seems normal to anyone embedded in that culture. Now, if you're a science communicator, it won't be quite that much, but it might get you behind the scenes access. You know, you might get to see someone's videos early and put some comments in, or get your name in the credits. It might give you access to a special members-only private chat room, or if you're giving someone maybe $50 a month, maybe there'll be a private video chat with the creator just for the folks who are spending that much money. Maybe that is okay. Maybe that's the way that social norms are going now, and I'm the old guy looking at that going, what on earth are the kids up to? That might be the case. But it can be, essentially, selling friendship. And again, it doesn't have to be. There are people who use it purely, a lot of people, who use it purely as a way of funding their work. But here is some of the advice that Patreon gives on how to get more people signed up for your monthly subscriptions. Bring your audience along for the ride by sharing pics, videos, and anecdotes from your life. Get vulnerable within reason. An emotional connection to you as the creator can be key in converting a fan to a patron. An emotional connection can be key in converting a fan to a patron. There is a very, very blurred line between being a fan of someone's work and being a fan of someone. And that's a line I find really uncomfortable. Because in part, my brain doesn't do parasocial relationships. It never has. Maybe there's something wrong up here. But there is, to me, a huge distinction between I'm a fan of X's work and I'm a fan of X. I know linguistically they can be shortened, but those are, to me, very separate concepts. I like the work of Derren Brown, mentalist, magician. I have shamelessly cribbed some of the techniques that I use in talks, some of the tricks I use, not like magic tricks, but some of the rhetorical tricks, shamelessly from his live shows. The idea of setting something up at the start and letting the audience forget it and then bringing it back at the end and revealing it's the key to the whole thing. I have blatantly ripped that off Derren Brown more than once. I thoroughly enjoy his work. I think he's a great entertainer. But I don't give a damn about the man himself because I don't know him. He's a stranger. Parasocial relationships and everything about the way that these one-way, one-to-many relationships work blur that line in the service of greater profit. I have a strong memory from when I was a kid, maybe about that tall, being asked in school to write something about a personal hero. And I didn't have any. With the benefit of adult hindsight, obviously the cop-out option was to talk about my parents, but as the kids around me wrote about sporting heroes or actors or whoever, I just sat there stumped. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized to most people, liking someone's work and liking someone are the same thing. And that was blindingly obvious to most people, I'm sure, but to young me, it was a revelation. There, that has revealed something personal and vulnerable within reason, thus helping create an emotional connection between me and the audience. Tick, the collection buckets will be by the door on the way out. Guys, like a cold breeze just came into the room. That was brilliant. So, why have I covered that in so much detail? What does all that have to do with science communication? It was worked out very early on in television history that the people who were good at getting an audience were not the people who went, ladies and gentlemen. They were the people who went, hey, hello. They weren't the people who went, how are you all doing tonight? They were the people who looked down the camera and said, how are you? It's a difference between talking to the audience and talking to the viewer. There is a difference between a nature documentary with stock footage and a voiceover and a David Attenborough nature documentary. There is a difference between Wonders of Life and Brian Cox's Wonders of Life. Sound quality, factual accuracy, video quality, they all matter, but not nearly as much as having someone on screen who the audience can connect with. My friend, Dr. Simon Clark, vlogged his PhD at Oxford. For the more old school people in the audience, vlogged essentially means video diary. Simon now has a doctorate in atmospheric physics, and in 2018, he stopped making personal videos about his life in favor of science communication, and he wrote this post about why and how. And I just want to quote a little bit from it. The motivation of watching someone struggle with the monumental task of researching a PhD was mostly what attracted viewers to watch. I was the product. By that, I mean that my lived existence on Earth was a commodity, something to be bottled, refined, and sold. Simon's recent science communication videos are really good, but some of his audience didn't stick around. As he changed from talking about his life to talking about his work, he has had to build a new audience who are interested in that post-academia career of his and about the subjects he's interested in now. He's getting there. He's doing really well. Dr. Clark is in the minority because he's qualified to talk about his subject. For every one of him, there are countless people speculating or repeating misguided facts or just flat out lying or trying to shill essential oils by claiming they cure cancer. You would hope that it's the people like Dr. Clark that would be authoritative, but often that's not the case. Authority frequently comes from having an audience, and having an audience comes all too often from that parasocial, emotional connection with people. If you are going to try to talk science to the world as an anonymous voice or a corporation just saying words, it doesn't really matter how well-cited your sources are or how groundbreaking your research is. You have to tell people about the human story that's in it. That's preferably your own. And to a certain extent, you have to be parasocial. So you may think, well, okay, on television we had gatekeeping. We did have that. There were certain standards. Surely it may well have been about parasocial relationships. There were occasional failures, but at least there were people we could relate to, even if they weren't technically qualified. And again, to be clear, most of the people who are doing this today are extremely qualified, and even if they're not, there is a whole team researching behind the scenes. But it's still the medium that gave us most haunted and ghost hunters. And even most haunted, you weren't watching because you're interested in ghosts. You're interested in watching the presenter go, ha! At something that wasn't there. And the online world is often seen as this uncontrolled, unmediated place where anyone can say anything about anyone. But the last few years have shown us that that's also not the case. Which brings me to the last main part of this, which is about echo chambers and Nazi bars. The final piece of the puzzle, working out why some lucky broadcasts go around the world and some don't, is talking about the people who pass them on. It's the groups in which someone can choose to amplify your voice or condemn it, where it's passed on, person to person to person, group to group to group. And some things are passed on because they're interesting or entertaining and for no more reason than that, but often it's because they support existing views, because it's reinforcing the in-group, or because it's diametrically opposed to those in-group's views and they can bond over despising it. Up there are the two extremes of online moderation. Let's talk about the Nazi bar first. This is what happens when a lot of sites are set up to be this sort of bastion of free speech, where anything legal, and by that they usually mean legal under United States law, anything legal is free to post. And you see this set up by the sort of well-meaning libertarian tech bros out of Silicon Valley. Reddit, which is one of the major hubs for discussion, at least among tech-savvy Americans, is perhaps the canonical example. They were set up as this perfect bulwark of free speech. If it is legal, Reddit will let you say it. Small groups in there might have their own rules, but other than that, it is a meritocracy. The best ideas will rise to the top, at which point, inevitably, the Nazis moved in. And that's not just a label. I'm not just slandering people with right-wing views there. I mean literal, modern-day neo-Nazis. And unlike like many European countries, the US does not have a law against incitement to religious or racial hatred, so that was legal. So Reddit let them play. Free speech, they said, could be countered with more free speech, and as you might expect, that lasted until it started to affect their bottom line. When there was, finally, when advertisers were starting to have trouble with them, when there was finally a crackdown on the overtly, staggeringly racist discussion there, this was the quote from one of Reddit's co-founders, and it's kind of astonishing. "We didn't ban them for being racist. We banned them because we have to spend a disproportionate amount of time dealing with them." This isn't exclusive to Reddit, by the way. Facebook's moderation has been similarly lax and inconsistent, and somehow they've mostly got away with it. The inevitable conclusion of let anyone say anything is that the worst people, having finally found a place that will let them in, start to drive out the more careful and cautious. So the discussion swings a little bit more towards their views, which means that more moderate people leave. So it swings a little bit that way, and the cycle continues and continues and continues until eventually you realize that either the worst people will survive, or maybe the moderators might want to kick out the Nazis. This is the analogy to the Nazi bar, the local pub. It might be the greatest place in town, but if they let the Nazis meet in the basement, you're not going to want to go in there. Or at least you're not going to tell your friends you go in there. In 2015, Reddit conducted a survey of its users. They found the number one reason that their users do not recommend the site, even though they use it themselves, is because they want to avoid exposing friends to hate and offensive content. So let's look at the other extreme, the echo chamber. For a better analysis of this, I would direct you to the work of Walter Quattrocchiocchi and the folks he works with from the Laboratory of Data Science and Complexity at Venice's Ca' Foscari University. I've mispronounced one of those words, I don't know which. In an echo chamber, there is definitely not free speech. no dissent is allowed. You see that in places like Facebook groups for multi-level marketing schemes and anti-vaxxers, where everyone has to buy in to the group's philosophy or else be branded a shill or a hater. Anyone with a dissenting opinion is shouted down by a large crowd, all of whom support each other in their views, whether that view happens to coincide with reality or not. And if all dissent is banned, you end up with a similar problem. The most obsessed, the most extreme radical believers chase out the people who aren't so sure. So the discussion on average starts to tolerate more extreme obsession and less dissent. And the cycle continues and continues and continues. And if those two failure modes sound similar, well, they sort of are. Both of those extremes are harmful. And note, I am not talking about political alignments here. I'm talking about the extreme edges of the policies that either allow anyone to say anything or allow no dissent whatsoever. And every major company that enables discussion has to pick where they sit, somewhere along that scale. So this is a post from a Florida-based natural medicine clinic that is selling homeopathic vaccines. I've anonymized them as best I can for obvious reasons. Their phone number shouldn't be up here. I think all of us here can agree that this is dangerous, and there will be wide-ranging views on whether that should be legal. I have to say they did get part of it right. Those are definitely safe for ages above 5. There is a concept on Twitter called the ratio. It's the number of replies you get to the number of likes to the number of retweets. If your retweets number is biggest, you have made something that has resonated and should be signal boosted and sent out to the world. If your likes number is biggest, you've said something heartwarming or personal or emotional that people want to sympathize with but maybe don't want to send on to their friends. If your replies number is largest, like at the bottom of that tweet, you've probably said something that a lot of people disagree with. And a response like that is called getting ratioed. That homeopathic vaccine tweet was thoroughly ratioed. Those 132 replies are all people mocking it or occasionally clearly laying out why homeopathic vaccines are a bad thing, along with a scientific consensus. I think we can agree at the Royal Institution it's probably a good idea for homeopathic vaccines to get some pushback. But here's the problem. 132 people suddenly replying to that company, who usually gets literally 0 replies to anything, is algorithmically indistinguishable from a mass abuse pile-on targeting a vulnerable person. If some awful person with a moderately sized following says, "Hey, I hate that guy, go and mock him," then machine learning systems cannot tell the difference between abuse and a company getting pushback for selling homeopathic flu shots. Any policy decision that is designed to reduce abuse on Twitter, to stop vulnerable people being mass targeted, which is vital and needed, is also going to help the snake oil peddlers. I don't know where to draw that. Policy decisions about community standards are often seen about drawing that line somewhere between the echo chamber and the Nazi bar, but there's this idea that if the company just nudges the line a little bit that way or nudges it a bit that way, there will be a perfect solution that keeps everyone happy. And I'm really sorry to say it, but it's not true. Echo chamber and Nazi bar are not two polar opposites. They are both a gradient and they overlap in the middle. You cannot choose the best option. You can only choose the least worst. A slight tangent, but I think that's due in part to the centralization of the web that's happened over the last 20 years or so. In the early 2000s, every discussion site out there was on a different server, run by a different person, maybe in a different country with completely different rules. And in that way, it sort of reflected the systems we've got now in real life. You know, one of those sites might well allow, vulgar abuse and back and forth argument. Another of those sites might ban someone for even mild swearing. And this is how it works in the real world. There is a big difference between the conversation that football fans have chanting as they go into the stadium and the conversation, the hallowed halls of the Royal Institution. I assume there is, Sean. I haven't been here after the last Christmas lecture. I guess it gets a little bit messy, but that different register and different social norms is true for a lot of the bubbles within Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. You can have community norms within smaller subgroups, but all those subgroups are centralized on platforms run by enormous, mostly American corporations, so the community standards have to be standardized through all of them, and they have to be what the corporation or their advertisers or VC backers will support. You cannot establish massive cross-platform policies that allow every type of discussion, or in the case of YouTube comments, any type of discussion whatsoever. The problem is that while the communities can be small, the platforms they're on are too big and too centralized. Because, some people just kind of go on Twitter and it's just like, it's a nice little coffee shop. It's a friendly space for some people I know. I'm just going to talk to my friends. And then suddenly, boom, they get this attack from these other people who use Twitter as this massive shouting match forum. They will search out anyone using this particular hashtag, anyone with these opinions, and they will shout at them because that's the way they use the platform. And a few people have tried to federate this, as it's called. There's a network called Mastodon, which is basically Twitter in several different servers. They all have their own different rules and they all talk to each other, but running a server is complex and expensive, and joining Twitter is free and easy. And why would you not do that? There is something called Discord, which is the closest I think there is to those old web forums, those old bulletin boards. Each discussion section is locked off and private and just separated from the rest of the world. Sounds like a great plan. Sounds brilliant. It's great. And it might work for a lot of small groups, but it still has a single federated, a single sign-on across the whole network. Unintended consequences are rife if you try and play about with this stuff. YouTube recently had an algorithm change which, tried to raise up authoritative voices. Suddenly, if you were watching videos about climate change, then you might be sent to someone like the Royal Institution's videos, which are about the scientific consensus, which means that suddenly all the people who were climate deniers, who were already entrenched with their views, were being sent to videos like the Royal Institution's. And suddenly underneath each of those videos, there are ill-thought-out, unscientific comments. And as a viewer, you can just scroll down a bit and go, there are my people. They're the ones that are right. Just like you might if the algorithm had determined that your fundamental beliefs were wrong. Which brings us back to the start. I'm pretty sure that the person running that homeopathic flu clinic genuinely thinks that they are doing good for the world. Their fundamental beliefs are at odds with reality. But that's never stopped people believing things. People may take what is just a saline injection and they may think that it's effective and they may spread flu, and that is in worst case lethal. And I'd argue that in a perfect world, those tech companies that facilitate that discussion have a moral imperative to reduce or remove messages like that. But it can't be that clear-cut because we aren't perfect. The people running them sure as hell aren't perfect. Now, ideally, the algorithms for Facebook or for any other YouTube, or for YouTube or for any other company, they would be able to think a little bit further ahead. They'd be able to increase long-term profits as their goal. At least that's what the corporations would like. They'd understand public relations and, they'd be able to work out what to do. And from humanity's perspective, the ideal algorithm would be, helping humanity to survive long term. It would suppress conspiracy theories and fake news, but it would allow enough entertainment and nonsense that we still pay attention to it. In 1950, Isaac Asimov wrote a story called The Evitable Conflict. It became the last chapter of I, Robot. And it was about giant supercomputers that run the world's economies. They were called the machines. And in the story, they're not being perfectly efficient. They're not perfectly designed. They're making small errors here and there. And it turns out, spoilers, for a book in 1950, spoilers, they are programmed to protect humanity. And they know us better than we know ourselves. A little nudge here, a little nudge there, then humanity is less likely to destroy itself. And the people who believe that the machines are doing that are more likely to be seen as conspiracy theorists. We don't have machine learning systems like that. We don't have that sort of artificial intelligence. Not yet, anyway. And, we can't tell a computer program, here are the odds of humanity surviving into the next century and beyond, improve them. And if we ever do have a machine learning system like that, the sort of super intelligence that could, in theory, control broad strokes of humanity, then the world will be about to change so much that fake news will be the least of our worries. If anyone ever does figure that out, I can only hope that its goal is not maximize the profit of one company. But until someone does work out an algorithm that can do all that, it's up to us. And I know this is a really corny note to end up on, but we are that system. It's up to us to fact check things before we pass them on. It's up to us to create things that are honest, that don't smudge the truth. It's up to the few of us that create and train those algorithms to understand the biases and make sure we're not creating conspiracy rabbit holes. And it's up to those of us who create things to manage those commercial demands of clickbait and drama against honesty and truth and help the world not turn into a horrible pit. The only algorithm for truth that we have right now is ourselves. My name's Tom Scott. Thank you very much.